Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Sunday School. Thank you so much for joining me today. As promised, I brought a new friend to introduce you to. This is my friend here, and you can tell he's a donkey. Hi, friend.
Hi,
Oh, what's your name?
my name is Donkey.
You're D Donkey.
Hmm?
Well, that's nice to meet you, D Donkey. Does the D stand for anything? D Donkey?
Well, it does, but it's kind of embarrassing to tell what it stands for.
Oh, that's silly. I'm sure there's nothing embarrassing about a name. Do you want me to guess what the D stands for?
Oh, okay.
Okay, let me think. Is your name Doug?
No,
Dennis.
no,
Well, that's not an embarrassing name. That was my dad's name. Is your name Daniel, like in the Bible?
no.
Do you kids have any guesses what D Donkey stands for? Oh, I know. Your name is David, like in the Bible.
Mm-mm.
Not David either? Well, I'm going to tell you, D Donkey, you don't have to be ashamed or embarrassed to tell us your name. I know the kids won't mind. In fact, it's a good lesson to remind us that we should never make fun of anybody's names. Names are special, and if they're a little bit different, we should never laugh. So I can promise you that I and the kids watching will not make fun of your name. So, what does the D in donkey stand for?
I really don't want to tell.
Oh, please.
It's so embarrassing.
We won't laugh, I promise. What's your name?
My name is Dudley the Donkey.
Dudley? Oh, that's a great name. I wouldn't be embarrassed about the name Dudley. Well, thank you, Dudley, for telling us your name and for joining us today for our Sunday school lesson.
You're welcome.
Why did I ask Dudley to be in our lesson today? Well, we actually have a tale of lost donkeys in our
Really?
Bible lesson today. Yeah, donkeys are actually in the Bible quite a lot. And we're going to look in the book of 1 Samuel and talk about some donkeys that got lost and how God used these lost donkeys to do something very, very important in the land of Israel. Would you like to hear our lesson today? Are your ears up and perked and listening?
Yes, they
Well, thanks for joining us, Dudley. You guys get your Bibles. We'll have our lesson for today. I hope you've got your listening ears on too. Well, for this morning's lesson, we're going to talk about the tale of the lost donkeys. And let me start with a question. Would you rather be a donkey? Well, not you, but would you rather, who are listening to me, would you rather be like a donkey or a king? Ooh, those are your choices. Would you rather be like a king or a donkey? Well, in our lesson today, we're going to talk about a king and we're going to talk about some donkeys. And we're going to see what lessons we can find from the Old Testament book of 1 Samuel that God has to teach us about whether he would rather have us act like these little donkeys here or a king. What do lost donkeys have to teach us here from the Old Testament? Now, my story today is going to cover a couple chapters, so you don't have to read along, but I am going to be in 1 Samuel. Chapter 8 is going to be a little bit of our background, and then chapter 9 is our story, and a little bit of chapter 10. Now, you know that David, King David, we've had lessons about him before, that he was the man after God's own heart. He started as a shepherd, and he became the king of Israel. But you know, you who have been listening in Sunday school for quite a few years probably, you know that David wasn't the first king of Israel. He was the second. But did you know that before David, God had also chosen a king in the land of Israel, and his name was Saul. He didn't become king because he had auditioned for the part or because all the people voted and said Saul should be the king. God actually chose Saul. And you might say, oh, but Saul, he was such a wicked man. He tried to kill David. He hated David. And God took the kingdom away from him. Yes, that is all true about Saul's life. But Saul didn't start out that way. And our tale of the lost donkeys is going to introduce us to how King Saul was found and chosen by God. And for that, we're going to look here in 1 Samuel chapter 8. Now, first, a little tiny bit of background about where we are. You remember the prophet Samuel. We've talked about him before. His mother Hannah had prayed for a son. There was only wickedness really all over the land of Israel. And his mother Hannah said, Lord, if you will give me a son, I will give him back to you, and he can serve you all the days of his life, and he can turn the hearts of the people back to God. Well, that's exactly what happened. Samuel was born. Hannah gave him to the Lord. He was raised there in the temple with Eli. And Samuel, he was a wonderful man of God who ruled the people and did teach them the words of God. So we read here in chapter 8, verse 1, it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. Samuel knew he was old. He wasn't going to live that much longer. But how sad. In verse 3, we read that his sons walked not in his ways, but they turned aside after lucre, or just money. They wanted to get money out of their serving God in such a way. And they took bribes and perverted judgment. And because of this, his sons were so wicked, they weren't following God. They weren't walking in the ways of their father Samuel. So because of this, we see here in our chapter that all the elders of Israel, they gathered themselves together, and they came to Samuel unto Ramah, there where Samuel was. And they said unto him, Behold, thou art old. They knew Samuel wasn't going to be around much longer to guide them. And they said, And thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. They wanted a king. They had never had a king before in the history of the children of Israel. All the other nations around them had kings. The kings would go to war. They had armies and battles. And Israel didn't have a king. Why? Did God forget to give them a king? No. From the very beginning, God said, Israel, my people, you're going to be different. You're not going to be like all the countries around you. God said, I'm going to be your king. You don't need a human king. I will be your king. And I will be the one to fight your battles. See, Israel was surrounded by enemies. They were surrounded by enemies here in our story. That's why they were upset. The Philistines were coming against them, and they needed a king, they thought. But God had always fought their battles. Remember going through the Red Sea? Remember the walls of Jericho just falling down? God fought their battles and helped them through. But now there's two reasons that they want a king. One was those sons of Samuel, they were wicked. And they didn't want the sons of Samuel being the ones ruling and reigning, really, in Israel. And they also wanted to be like the countries all around them. And from that, before we move on to our story about the donkeys, which are coming up soon, I want to just look at two quick lessons from that verse. You know, if there's someone who calls themselves a Christian and they don't act like a Christian, like these sons of Samuel, that doesn't mean that we quit following the Lord and say, well, I don't want to obey God anymore because these people here, they're not acting like Christians, so I'm not going to follow God anymore. No, that was a bad excuse. Because could God have raised someone up just like Samuel when he was a boy to lead the people and to teach them the things of God? God could have done that. God can do anything. He did it with Samuel. He could have done it again. But they didn't have their faith and their trust put in God anymore. They said, no, we want a king. For that second reason, they wanted to be like all the countries around them. And you know, sometimes we can look at the people around us, people that don't love God, that don't know the one true God, and we say, I want to be like them. I want to do the things they do and have this. I don't want to be different as a Christian. But God said to his people, you're going to be different. You're going to have me as a king. How special is that? And he says to us as Christians, you're going to be different than the people around you who don't know God. You will have my love and joy and peace in your heart, and you're going to act different, and you're going to be different. And sometimes we don't want to be different. We want to be like everybody else. And Samuel, what do we read that he did when his heart was sad and he was discouraged because the people wanted a king and his sons were behaving badly? What did Samuel do? We read in verse 6, And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. He just told God all about it. Well, God's answer to Samuel was this. Really, he didn't want the people ever to have a human king. He wanted them to rely on him. That was his first choice. That was his best plan for their lives. But the people had rejected God, and so he said to Samuel, go ahead and give them a king. And so they scattered abroad and they went back to their cities and they were happy. They were going to get what they wanted, what they thought was best for them. But was that God's best? No. I encourage you who are listening to me, always go to God and say, Lord, what do you want for my life? Because God will let us have our own way, but it's not the best way. It's not his perfect plan for our lives. And so now we come to the part where God decides to speak to some donkeys, to do his will, to make his plan come to pass, because God had chosen a young man to be the very first king of Israel, because that's what the people wanted. And so God had a choice. There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, and it gives his father and his father and his father here, and it says that he had a son whose name was Saul. And it says here he was a choice young man. He was the best of the best and goodly, and there was not among the children of Israel a goodlier or handsomer person. You wanted to look at him. He was pleasant. He was a nice young man, nice to look at. And it says from his shoulders and upward, he was higher than any of the people. He was a tall young man that was pleasant and handsome. And that was this young man, Saul. Now, did he live in Ramah, where Samuel was? Did Samuel know Saul? No, they'd never met before. Saul actually lived quite a ways away. And yet God put his hand on this young man and said, he's the one I've chosen to be the next king of Israel. But how is Samuel going to find him? Is Samuel say, oh, there's this young man in Ramah that I know, and I'm going to choose him, and I've seen him before, and I think he's going to be the next king? No, God has a plan and God has a way, and now he's going to use some donkeys. Because we read that the asses, that's another word for donkeys, of Saul's father were lost. And maybe he'd put them out to the field to graze, but they just kept walking. And pretty soon, no one could find the donkeys. The donkeys weren't anywhere around. Do you know who had spoken to the donkeys and told them to get moving? It was actually God. How do I know that? Because this is how God is going to get Saul to go and meet Samuel. See, God can do anything. God uses his whole creation in his plan. He uses the weather. He uses people. He uses animals. He uses anything he wants to accomplish his will in our world because he's the creator of everything. He's done and made everything, and he can control it. Did you know that he talks to animals? He spoke to donkeys that day and told them exactly where to go. Donkeys don't just wander off miles and miles away on their own. They're very stubborn, and as long as they've got a patch of grass, they're happy. So God had to lead these animals. He had to speak to them. You know, it's not the first time God has spoken to animals. It's not the last. He still speaks to animals today, I'm sure, and tells them what to do. You remember that great fish that had swallowed Jonah, that whale? It says that God spoke to the fish and he vomited out Jonah onto the dry land. At the exact moment that he wanted Jonah on the beach, he spoke to the whale. He talked to the ravens, remember, that came and fed Elijah? He told them exactly what to bring him and to feed him. And God can speak to animals. And you know what the animals do? They obey. They obey God. And so Kish said to Saul his son, take now one of the servants with thee, and arise and go and seek the asses, or try to find my donkeys. I want to know where they are. Well, it says that he passed through Mount Ephraim. He passed through the land of Shalisha. They found them not. And then they passed through the land of Shalom, and there they were not. And he passed through the land of the Benjaminites, but they found them not. They were days away. They were miles away, and this is unusual that donkeys would go that far. But remember, God had spoken to the donkeys. The donkeys with their big ears, they listened to God, and they went. Well, when they were come to the land of Zuph, Saul said to his servant that was with him, "Come and let us return, lest my father leave caring for the asses and take thought for us." After a while, they'd been gone so long, Saul said, "You know what? My dad isn't going to care anymore about the donkeys. He's going to think that we've fallen off a cliff or been robbed or hurt or lost." And so he said, "We're going to go back." And then the servant said, "Well, in this city over here, there is a seer. There's a man of God. He's an honorable man. And he's a prophet. He knows things. We could go see him and ask him if he knows where the donkeys have gone to. He could help us." So they decided to go there. And Saul said, "Come, let us go." And they went into the city where the man of God was. Who was the man of God? It was Samuel. And Saul, had he ever met Samuel before? No. But see, God had chosen Saul to be the king. Samuel was here in Ramah. And so God was going to work it all out together. And what did he use? He used some donkeys to wander away from the field so that Saul would have to go to Ramah. God is so wonderful. He can do anything, and he can use anything to do his will. Well, as they're coming up to the city, they say, "Can you tell us where this man of God is?" And so they lead him there. Now in verse 15, listen to this. It says, "Now the Lord had told Samuel in his ear a day before Saul came." Oh, do you remember when Samuel was just a little boy and he was sleeping in the temple at night and he heard God's voice saying, "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel started listening to God's voice when he was a little boy. Now here in our story, he's an old man, and he's still listening to God's voice. Are you going to be a person like that, a Christian like that, who starts listening to God when you're young, and then your whole life through, even up into an old man or an old woman, to say, we're still listening, we still hear God's voice? Well, a day before, Samuel had heard God's voice in his ear saying, "Tomorrow about this time, I will send thee a man out of the land of Benjamin, and thou shalt anoint him to be captain over my people Israel, that he may save my people out of the hand of the Philistines. For I have looked upon my people, because their cry is come unto me." God is so wonderful. He loves his people so much, and he cared about them and their enemies around them that were going to attack them. And even though they said, "We don't want you to be our king anymore," God says, "I still love you, and I'm still going to take care of you, and I'm still going to save you from your enemies. Even though you're not following me, I'm going to be faithful to you. And I'm going to send you a man, Saul, and he's going to save you out of the hand of the Philistines." And so when Samuel saw Saul, the Lord said unto him, "Behold, the man whom I spake to thee of, this same shall reign over my people." And so Saul comes to the gate and he sees Samuel and he says, can you tell me where the house of the seer or the prophet is?" And Samuel said, "I am the seer. Go up before me, and today you're going to have a feast. You're going to be my guest. And tomorrow you can go home. And I will let thee go and tell thee all that is in thine heart." Well, Saul must have been so confused. Well, I'm going to a feast here, and I'm going to be the guest of honor, and I can go home tomorrow, and he's probably still worried, but I have a task. My dad sent me to find these donkeys. And so Samuel says, "And as for thine asses that were lost 3 days ago," he knew all about it. He had just met Saul, but God had told him this truth. "Set not thy mind on them, for they are found." I know where the donkeys are. It's all going to be okay. Well, we can't read all these verses. The lesson is long as it is. And so what happens is that Saul and the servant, they go up to this feast. They were given the chiefest place of honor there in the house, and they were fed like royalty. And then the next day, as they're leaving the city, it says they were going down to the end of the city. Samuel was there with Saul and his servant. They were going to go back home. And he said to Saul, "Bid the servant to pass on before us." And he passed on. He said, "I need to speak to you in private. Stand thou still a while, that I may show thee the word of God." Now Samuel was going to let Saul in on the secret, that God, of all the thousands of men there in the land of Israel, God had chosen him, Saul, to be the king over Israel, to be the captain of the host. And Samuel took a vial of oil and poured it upon his head, and kissed him, and said, Is it not because the Lord hath anointed thee to be captain over his inheritance? Saul, you're going to be the captain over God's people Israel. You're going to be the king. You're going to lead them into battle. You're going to be God's choice for his people Israel. And that day, something even more special happened. It says that the Spirit of the Lord would come upon Saul. Samuel says to him, And thou shalt prophesy, and shalt be turned into another man. In that day, God gave Saul a new heart. He filled him with the Spirit of the one true God. Saul was a new person, and he was going to be God's choice to lead his people. And it says that it was so that when he had turned his back to go from Samuel, so the minute they said goodbye, Saul's going to go back to his father's home, God gave him another heart. And all those signs came to pass that day. Samuel had given him a list of things that he was going to see, things that were going to happen, and every single thing happened just as the Lord had told Samuel it would happen. And Saul, he has this new heart. He has the Spirit of God inside of him. When he gets home, his uncle says, Where have you been? And he said, Well, we've been looking for the donkeys, which were found, just like Samuel said they would be. And he said, we ran and we met the prophet Samuel. And the uncle said, What did he say to you? And Saul didn't say about being anointed the king of Israel. When the people had been called before the Lord at Mizpah, Samuel called everyone back together, called all the tribes and all their families. He reminded them that they had rejected God as their king. And he said, Now, today, I have a king to present to you. And so he first brings the tribe of Benjamin. Oh, the king was going to come out of the tribe of Benjamin, and everyone gets excited. And then he says it's going to be of this family and this family. And finally, it gets narrowed right down to the family of Kish. And when Samuel goes to bring Saul out of this family and say, Here's your king, they said, Well, Saul's not here. Does anyone know where he is? And the Lord whispers again in Samuel's ear and says, Well, behold, he hath hidden himself among the stuff. He's hiding. He probably was feeling overwhelmed. Why would you choose me? I'm the least of the tribe here of the Benjaminites, and why would you choose me for this huge job? I don't know if I can do it. He was hiding. They ran and fetched him thence, and when he stood among the people, he was higher than any of the people from his shoulders and upward. And Samuel said to all the people, See ye him whom the Lord hath chosen. I want you to remember that. God had chosen Saul to be this king over Israel, that there is none like him among all the people. And they loved the sight of Saul. They loved that he was strong and tall and handsome. And so the people shouted and said, God save the king. And that's how Saul was made king. It was because God had chosen him. Not because he wanted the job. He was hiding when they went to make him and announce him that he would be the next king. Not because Samuel had picked him. Samuel didn't even know him. But because God had chosen Saul to be the king. And God had used something humble like a pack of donkeys to go and get lost so that Saul would come to Samuel and meet him and be anointed as the next king. Now, I would love to be able to tell you that Saul, he brought the people to God. He had that Spirit of the Lord in him always, and that he followed God and obeyed him. But you know the story of Saul. After he was made king, he was so filled up with pride because he had won battles, and his pride turned into impatience because he offered a sacrifice when Samuel didn't come in time, and he took it upon himself to not obey God and to offer a sacrifice, which only the priest should do. And then he was angry, and he didn't follow God's will. And then he became jealous because David was the one who was getting victories in battles. And you know, Saul didn't have to go down that road. When God had chosen him, he had such opportunity to do wonderful things in the land of Israel, to be a wonderful leader who turned the people to God. But he stopped listening to the voice of God. He grieved that spirit that was in him, and he turned his back away from God. Now, at the end of our lesson today, let me ask you this question. When we think of our tale of the lost donkeys and what we learned here from the book of 1 Samuel, do you think God wants us to be more like our donkey friend or like King Saul? You know, they actually had something in common, our donkey and King Saul. They were both chosen and used by God for a specific task, a specific reason. King Saul here, he was chosen by God to be the first king over the land of Israel. And these donkeys in our story, they were chosen and used by God to get lost, really, so that Saul could go and find Samuel and meet him and be anointed. God used this donkey. But you know how God gave a specific path for the donkey to follow and to keep walking and walking and walking until he came to Ramah? God had a specific plan and a path for Saul. But who followed God's path? Saul started out really well. He started out as a man who was filled with the Spirit of God and who was giving God's words, and he was going to be God's captain to give victory over the enemies. But when he let his heart be filled with sin, with pride, with disobedience, with jealousy and anger, then he wasn't following God's path anymore. You know, it might seem exciting to say, I want to be a king, I want to be like the king, but really, you know what God asks us to be? He asks us to be more like this donkey. Because the donkey had a plan from God to be used by God, and he just followed God's plan, and God was able to use him. Saul, he let his heart get puffed up with pride and anger and disobedience and jealousy, and he stopped following God's plan. You know, God has a perfect plan and a perfect path for your life. And he wants you to be not like a proud, puffed up King Saul. He actually just wants you to be like this little donkey that says, Lord, I want to do what you want me to do. I want you to use my life, even if it's just a small little life of a donkey. I want you to use me as part of your plan. I will follow your path. Don't be a young person who starts out like King Saul. Oh, so much promise, so much potential, following God and wanting to do right, and then getting off of God's path and not fulfilling God's will for his life. Saul could have been such an amazing person, an amazing character in God's word, but he lost it all because he decided to listen to his own heart and follow sin. I think we should be more like this donkey. God, where do you want me to go? How can you use me in your big plan, in your big story? I'll just do whatever you want me to do, and I'll stay on that path my whole life. Kind of like Samuel, remember? Listening to God as a boy, listening to God as an old man, and everywhere in between. Let's have these big ears like our friend here to listen to God and to follow his path. I hope you have a great week. I will see you next time with another Sunday school lesson. Bye-bye.